I'll be arguing for a principled semiotic approach to teaching and learning. And, you know, what does this mean, a semiotic approach? It means taking, in a way, looking at teaching, both teaching and learning, from the angle of meaning making. And so we're very interested in how we make meaning, particularly through language as the principal meaning making system, and how does that impact on teaching and learning. So I'll also argue that building a meta-semiotic awareness, it's an unusual word, meta-semiotic, but usually you would see the word in conjunction with meta-language, right? So a meta-language meaning a language for talking about language. So, but I'm kind of, I think I'm borrowing the term, well, I'm not the first to use it. I think Mary Macken-Horaric uses it, and that's why I felt confident about using it myself. If Mary can use it, I can. But meta-semiotic, that is having an awareness of all of the meaning-making systems that are at stake when we're both teaching and learning, for teachers and students. So this is taking into account the visual as well as other meaning-making systems, even dance, you know, physical movement, everything around how we make meaning. Saying something about building this semiotic disposition with teachers through professional development programs. This is one of the great challenges, and in a way it's been my kind of you know, work over the last 20 years has been working with teachers. That's the work I love. That's the work I think is really crucial in building those kinds of understandings around language and meaning making with teachers. So how do we do that? So I'll say something about some of the courses that we write and what's in them, but not much more than that. And then spending most of the time showing some examples of how that work is recontextualized in the classroom. So you know, once you build this kind of understandings with teachers around language in particular, what do they do with it? How do they take that up, and how does that, what might that look like in the classroom? Okay. All right. As always, I feel like it's always a good thing to make some acknowledgement of where the theory comes from. And of course, Michael Halliday is, everybody's kind of aware of his work, and that's where the work began. Jim, of course, Jim Martin is also widely known, but lesser known probably is the work of Joan Rothery. And I received this picture this morning from Fran Christie, and so it was taken a few days ago. So, and it replaced that horrible one that I had before. I could see Winnie nodding there. So this is Joan, and Joan had an enormous influence on that whole genre pedagogy. You know, her research with Jim back in, I think, '83, when they looked at, I think, I'm sort of being a bit vague here, but something like 2,500 pieces of work from primary school, and found a predominance of narrative and recounts within that. And so that was kind of seminal research that inspired Joan and Jim to look at other ways of doing schooling besides writing narratives. We were talking about this the other day, you know, and I said, do you know what? I've got an admission to make. I've never written one narrative in my entire life. And look at me. Okay, so this is a lovely quote from Joan. She wrote this in 1996. She says, the message is clear for educators. If we want our students to develop high levels of literacy and a critical orientation, we must engage them at all levels in an explicit focus on language. Not just language, but explicitness about how language works to mean is at the heart of educational linguistics. So this has always been an inspiring quote, and her work has always been inspiring for me in my work. So, you know, being explicit about how language works, how it works to mean, is something that I think we should build in to all teachers' dispositions. That's the argument, really. Okay, another nod to Jerome Bruner, of all people. And I love this little quote from him. He says, "We begin with the hypothesis that any subject can be taught effectively in some intellectually honest form to any child at any stage of development." How good's that, you know? How liberating that is. You know, what he's saying, or I think he's saying, is that if we provide the right kinds of learning, the right kinds of scaffolding, then the children can take on the meanings, you know. One of the things that we, many of us, but John and me in particular, John Polias and I, have been kind of working against over the years, has been this kind of dumbing down of what teachers should know about language. And even in our recent national curriculum, which is saying something really crucial about the role of language in teaching and learning, we see that same thing happening again. But, you know, there are also a lot of good things happening within that as well. So we've always tried to keep the bar, you know, the bar up very high, both for teachers, but in turn the students as well. Okay, this text here was printed in 1990, I think. Bev Deravianka, whose work is legendary, really. Her work with teachers, both in Australia and I think she's been here, hasn't she? Yes, and so she's been to many parts of the world talking about this work. So this work was very inspiring for us, but one of the things that inspired me when I looked at this book here, it says here generalised participants, action verbs and so on. It says, so it's using the technical language, but you know, the teachers would understand the notion of this thing having a structure, right? So it's got some kind of structure running through it, but the notion of the teachers having a good understanding of what the language features look like was another story. And they needed to know that. That was something that, you know, inspired our early work. Okay, so just to reiterate that whole notion of providing high challenge and high support and not kind of going to these other territories, you know, where you're providing high challenge and low support. So, you know, it's easy to set high challenge for students, just make it very difficult for them, you know. Do critical theory in year 3, you know. That's how you provide high challenge, but you know, if there's no support for them to get to those meanings that you're setting up here, then there's, you know, it's unproductive. You know, for us working in the ESL field, John and I, this is where a lot of ESL, English as a second language teaching, was located. Lots of support for these poor little kiddies that are struggling with English, you know, but very, very low challenge. So, so John and I were particularly keen to move into this territory here, where we provided high challenge both for the teachers and the teachers in turn for the students, but also provided high support for that as well. Just a quick kind of review. So we started our work back in about the mid-90s, and I've got this kind of slightly faded because it's an early version of the language and literacy course. It didn't look like that. It was sort of photocopied and in, you know, pages that were just black and white. But eventually we started that work in about the mid-90s, I guess, you know. By 2002, I think, 2003, it had been published in more salubrious kind of form, you know. And then we started at this point here, we started the tutor training courses, so training tutors to run this course. And this is the kind of version that it's in now, the How Language Works course. Okay. And in that course, and this hasn't changed that much across the language and literacy course and the How Language Works course, I'll just kind of walk through these because this will give you an idea of that high bar, you know, for the teachers. So, you know, this is the model of language, and our attempt to recontextualize it, of course, for the teachers. So there it is in all its beauty. We get down into the language system and we start to look at different kinds of meanings here. and how those meanings are realised, the sort of grammatical realisations of those meanings. So that's the territory we covered in the course. Okay, in recent times we've added other courses like the Teaching ESL Students in Mainstream Classrooms here, which has been around for quite a while now. And the most recent one is the Literacy for Learning. And the Literacy for Learning came up because in our state, in the state of South Australia, they were saying that teachers weren't, and schools weren't, they wouldn't kind of go to this easily, this How Language Works course, right? So they needed something that was a little simpler, a little easier for them to move into. And this is something for people here in Denmark, as I said yesterday, to think about in terms of, you know, do you go to a 10 3-hour module full-on, almost university course, you know, once again keeping the bar high, but is it a bit too high, you know? Maybe for some people, having an intermediary kind of course would help a lot. Okay, I'm not sure how familiar people are with this model of language, but as I said yesterday, and I feel like I'm repeating some of the stuff, and I have to apologise for repeating it because it's Norway, Denmark, and now here, some of it again. So, but this is not, I'm not expecting you to understand this. I'm not sure how familiar people are with this model, but this is what it looks like, and this is how we draw on it and how we talk about it in those courses. So we're looking at it in terms of genre. So what and there we focus on the purpose of the text and the stages and phases of the text here. And this has been a recent addition, this whole notion of phases of the text, built on taking on the work of Jim Martin and David Rose's work on that. And in terms of the register, we look at the field, which in a more common sense meaning is the subject matter, the tenor, the roles and relationships that hold in any kind of context, and then the mode, and the mode of communication. And this is how spoken or written the text is and the channel of communication. In the national curriculum, they take up in the Australian national curriculum, they talk about subject matter, roles and relationships, and the mode of communication. You could be a bit cynical and say, well, because these terms are too difficult for teachers, aren't they? You know? And, you know, the irony is, of course, and you'll see this as we move into the presentation, is that children have no problem with these things. You know, the children have no problem with taking up the technicality if it's mediated appropriately, as Bruna says, yeah? Okay. And so then we look at the language choices that express the meanings we want to make. So if we're going to understand, you know, how language gets taken up in terms of the meanings we want to make, then we have to understand that language system. One of the things we do is we look at it as a register continuum, or we look at the register continuum, so the field moving from everyday and concrete to more technical and abstract. The tenor moving from informal, personal and novice to formal, impersonal, informed. And then the mode, most spoken, the here and now, language accompanying action, to most written generalised, where language constitutes the text. So this has proved extremely helpful for teachers. They love this, you know. And some of the schools I'm working in Melbourne, they put this up on the wall, you know. You go into the classroom and there it is on the wall, and they constantly referring to it. And just as an aside, I've been saying for many years, it's sort of anybody that wants to listen, that the register is the missing kind of bit of the model, you know, because when this pedagogy first took hold in the late 80s, early 90s, it was sort of genre, you know, the genre stuff with its focus on structure and kind of language features, you know, so you went genre and language features, but missed this intermediary level that's so crucial, because, you know, meaning making is so nuanced. Do you know what I mean? It's so delicate in the way we do it. And so to understand that and to respond to that, I think this register level is just absolutely crucial. Okay, at the same time we took on the teaching and learning cycle, and this is the teaching and learning cycle that came out of the Disadvantaged Schools program in Sydney. And once again, you know, many people contributed to the theory around this particular teaching and learning cycle, but Joan Rothery was right in there with this, you know, and contributing to this. So, and we've adapted it. We've made kind of, you know, additions to this. When I say we, John and me, we've kind of taken it in slightly different directions than others may have. So, you know, one of the things we talk about is developing control of the focus, genre and register. So one of the big issues in schooling, at least in Australia, is this kind of cluttered curriculum. You know, there's just so much going on. And when you look at units of work, it's very helpful to get teachers just to kind of unclutter it and get them to focus on maybe one genre and its register, you know, rather than 9 genre and then 90 registers, you know. So we build up this, setting the context, modelling and deconstruction, so looking at the models of the text and pulling them apart, and then jointly constructing them, where the teacher takes on that more expert role, but the students are have taken on some semi-expertise because they've been through this cycle where they've built up enough meanings to be, you know, what's the word, useful participants, or not equal participants in the joy construction, but strong contributors, if I can put it that way. How about that? Strong contributors to that. So the teacher's not doing all the work. And the secondary teachers particularly recognise that this is a very kind of something that they don't do, right? They don't do. And when they do it, they find it extremely difficult, actually. It's extremely difficult to find really good examples of teachers doing this with students. Okay. Within that, we can, you know, there's kind of variations within this. So we talk about embedded cycles. It's not just a kind of a, even though this is a cycle, it's not just a linear kind of walkthrough of this, but it's much more complex, and we tried to pick that up by talking about embedded cycles within that. Recently, well, in our work before, this is based on Pauline Gibbons's work, who I understand also did one of these presentations, so that's a nice connection. But in Pauline Gibbons and I think in Jenny Hammond's work, they talked about macro and micro scaffolding. John recently, last year, he came up with this term Mezzo Scaffolding, and he's very excited about it because he thought he'd come up with a new term that really captures something that's going on between this more macro, where you're looking at the planned and carefully sequenced tasks, and then the micro interactions between the teachers and the students. But somebody said, oh, I think somebody's already come up with that term, and so I Googled it, and Van Leer actually has used the term Mezzo Scaffolding, so in about 98. But he doesn't, of course, use it quite the same way that we're using it. So we're looking at it in terms of shifts in register, which is a different angle on it than Van Leer. But getting teachers to work at all those different levels in terms of the scaffolding is really crucial. This is a question Jib asked in one of his articles. He sort of ends up, and he's talking about Joan Rothery and the difference between Joan Rothery's work and David Rose's work in terms of the reading to learn. And Joan always had this strong belief about the role of the meta-language, as I do, by the way. I'm very, this is something that I think is really a key to this whole notion of understanding meaning making and the capacity to talk about it, of course. So Jim asked the question, is meta-language in fact scaffolding that hangs around? So that when you have that meta-language and you go off to the next meaning making practice that you indulge in, does that meta-language help you in that endeavour? I was looking at the presentation yesterday. It was all in Danish, the whole thing. And I just sat there and looked, and they had the handout, but when there was a little bit on nominalisation, you know, and I know a little bit about nominalisation in English. I know very little about it in Danish, but I could see the patterns, and I already starting to bring some understandings of nominalisation from English into that of Danish. So there's a little bit of scaffolding that, you know, is hanging around. It's just one little example. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 examples here, and once again, apologies to those that have seen these before, but we'll start off with this one here, and this is teaching about language. So we'll look at 3 contexts: social studies, science, and languages, and we'll begin with this one. And this is from a Spencer Foundation research project many years ago, and in this particular work, we're going to look at transitivity, active and passive voice, theme, reme, and which clauses that these teachers taught their students about or engaged their students with. Now, the students were 7 years old, right? So this is a Year 2 class at St Margaret Mary's, Croydon, which in Adelaide is a kind of western suburb school. You know, not a very salubrious area. Salubrious, what's a translation for salubrious in Danish? It's a working class area of Adelaide, right? And 70% second language children, so 70% of the children in the school speaking a second language. And what they were doing is they were looking at this whole question of how does the milk get from the cow to the refrigerator, you know? So, you know, students just think it's in there, don't they? It's in the shop, it's in the bottle, that's where it is. So they were going to write a sequential explanation around that. Okay, so this is a nice topic. It's grounded in, you know, something that children can see, and something that's within their experience. So, all right. In terms of the teaching and learning cycle, I'm just showing this just to emphasise that they didn't kind of pile into the grammar, you know. It wasn't a kind of a grammatical, you know, a set of grammatical lessons or lessons on the grammar and language, sort of with a little bit of a nod to making meaning about milk. You know, the whole thing is about milk production, and the grammar is in the service of understanding about that. That's a big difference, isn't it? You know? And I know as a teacher, I remember the horror I felt in my second year teaching when I was told to teach a formal English class in Year 9 at Ross Trevor College. Go and teach formal English. You know, and we're supposed to teach the kids about verbs and things like that. It was just horrible. I had no sort of really way of even understanding why it was horrible, except that I just didn't like doing it. And this is from someone who's very interested in language and grammar even then, you know. Okay, so there it is. They're the sort of some of the activities. We could list 3 or 4 slides of all of the activities in this particular lesson. Okay, so one of the things that was the focus of this particular work was the transitivity and you know, what constitutes the clause, how's the clause made up. So there's a central process. This is from Halliday Matheson's book, of course. We've added the colour coding here, which we borrowed from Ruth French in you know, whose work at Haberfield Primary School was just absolutely seminal. Her work with Jeff Williams and Joan that year at Haberfield Primary. She introduced that colour coding, and we brought her over to South Australia, I think about 96 or something like that. And so our teachers took up that colour coding, and now it's in Ruth's book, you know, on Danish, SFG for Danish. Isn't this amazing? Yeah, so that colour coding is carried. Okay. All right, I won't go into explaining that, but we'll see that as we go through the unit of work anyway, how these kind of fall out. All right, so the children were introduced to transitivity. It's somewhere along. This is one of the activities they did. And you can see that this is a child, this is an independent kind of analysis that the child's done. And, you know, there's some couple of little mistakes here, but boy, for those of us that have been doing SFL, systemic functional linguistics, for a long time, we know that these kinds of attribute participants give us grief, don't they? Yeah, so they're giving this little child grief as well. Yeah, okay. So what they did was they looked at, exploiting the transitivity, and I was in this lesson when this happened, and they were looking, they did a bit of a revision on the grammar here, and then they put this sentence up. I remember Louise said to Donna's the ESL teacher down the back, said, "Ms. Reithmuller, can you give us a sentence?" And I was going, oh hell. You know what it's like? You know, you get a sentence and you find something's wrong grammatically, but of course they'd planned it beforehand. She knew what sentence, so that was the sentence they gave. And they analysed that with the kids in revision. This was some revision work now. And they talked about the possibilities of the movement here, particularly these circumstances here, you know. They're most mobile in English. They're the things that can move around a bit more in English than anything else. Okay. Here's another possibility. Okay, so of course the kids laughed. Yeah. So what they did was a tricky little thing. Underneath this was they had to eventually turn it over, and underneath they turned it over. And when they turned it over and rearranged it, you know, they saw that the passive form was there on the card. Yeah, pretty tricky, hey? This is what happens when you let teachers loose, you know, with this work. Yeah. And they just called those helping words. They didn't kind of go into the technicality too much there. Helping words. But what they did do then was go into doer and done to, you know. So who's the actor here in here? We know this is the technical term. They just used doer and done to. They didn't use actor and goal. And then, of course, when you're doing the passive voice, you've got the done to coming up the front of the clause. Okay, and of course, what you could do is just take out the actor, right? So we get the cows were milked yesterday morning. So, yeah. Okay, so here's Josephine again. These are the only remnants of this research I have left. It's a little long way. But the doer and the done to, and the doer and the done to. It's, you know, these are 7-year-olds coping with this stuff. They also introduced which clauses. How am I going for time? Good? Yeah? Okay, so raw milk is pumped into the to the silos, and what's happening here is they're looking at these elaborating, if you call it elaborating which clauses, you know, which pick up the kind of clause that picks up something, some technical term that's appeared, like the one that comes to mind because I've used it so many times is the esophagus, right? Comma, which is a thin, long, thin cylindrical tube, right? Something like that. So you get this kind of picking up the technical term. So here the technical term in a way is raw milk, right? So if you pick up that technical term and, you know, insert that, it elaborates on what raw milk is, right? So they showed the kids how to do that. Okay, this is some of the pictures of some of the work. They're not supposed to do this, by the way, till year 8. You know, they're not supposed to know how to use these kinds of clauses till they're 13 years old, you know, because you know what it's like. Okay, so these are 7-year-olds. And it just got worse, you know, because they started to look at the flow of information here, so they started to look at theme and rhyme. And they tried to not use theme and rhyme because they thought it was really getting a bit silly, you know, with all this technicality, but they gave up and eventually started using theme and rhyme because what do you say? The words that come before the verb in the sentence, you know, at the front of the sentence, you know, in the way. So, and we can see that you know, what's happening here, this which picks up the refrigerated tanker. So it's picking up from, this is theme and this is rhyme. So this new theme is coming from this previous rhyme. Similarly here, which delivers the raw milk to the factory, you can see that there's 2 choices being made here that are kind of harking back or drawn from the previous rhyme. So they showed the kids how to do that. You don't want to be doing this with every clause in English, by the way. You can see how silly it would get, you know. Okay, so here's a couple of texts. This is Andrew, who's one of the weakest students in the class. Weakest writers, I should say. And you can see that all of those kinds of features that they worked on, and you know, this kind of thing here. Can you see this? It's fairly clumsy, isn't it? It's clumsily expressed, but the child is using a which clause, you know. He's using a passive voice and so on. So in terms of the scaling, and this is using the ESL scope and scales, John's ESL scope and scales, this was scaled at about 3, scale 3, and this was scale 8. So, and on the scope and scales, the students move through those really at 1 scale a year. So, you know, 3 to 8 really is 5 years of work. Okay. This is Hien. This is one of the, she's probably the strongest writer in the class. And she's written a pretty good text before without any kind of work on this at all. You know, you can see that, can't you? Yeah? Okay. Here's her text after. And you can see there's lots of features you could talk about here. You could look at the technicality of the kinds of technical words she's using. But you could look at the passive voice. You can look at the raw milk, which is milk straight from the cow, but that would be straight out of the lesson. Would you agree? They did that during the lesson, so you could say, well, she's just copied it. But you can see that when you get down to this part here, the raw milk is now pasteurised, which is heating the milk up, and homogenised, which is spreading the cream, you know. That's her work, you know, and so we'd say. So once again, some huge improvements in even the best students in the class. So 4 to 8. Okay. All right, so we go to the science one now, and this is some work we did with, that I did with Anita Hall and Carol Jones. Anita is the class teacher. Carol was the ESL literacy expert within the school. And this is a work on a unit of work on light. And they were covering a number of genres, so explanation, information report, and practical report. There are about 3 genres, but this was going on for some time, maybe even over 2 terms, you know, so maybe 20 weeks. So this is quite a lengthy bit of work in science. Okay. The school itself had done some professional development program. To get it, if you want to teach in that school, you have to do that course. You know, and so there's a common set of understandings built up at the school through that course. I mean, there's other ways of doing it, but that's what they've chosen to do it through. And they've had significant success. They're a Western Suburbs school. They've got high ESL proportions. They've got a new arrivals program. You can see it here, a new arrivals program here. And their NAPLAN data, their national testing data, it puts them right up there with the best primary schools in the state. All right? And, you know, in their report, I think it's 2011, they attribute that success to 5 years of working with the functional model of language. That'd be the first school that's ever attributed a success to that, wouldn't they? You know, it's a strange thing to attribute success to. Okay. So they did light, that's what they're doing, light and its properties. And the teaching and learning cycle was something that was, you know, very, very strongly used or taken up by the teachers in this school. They all knew it. Their focus genre, we're going to focus on this one, the causal explanation, how a periscope works. So the kids are eventually going to make a periscope out of, you know, milk cartons. Oops. That's what happens when you hit the wrong button. Ooh. No. I fooled myself here. The light's supposed to be dark. This is how they started, and the lights in the room are supposed to be dark. So what's going on? And anyway, when they started this unit of work of light, they set up the classroom so that the teacher had something out the front. It might have been that vase of flowers, but the room was very dark, and the kids walked in. What's going on here? What's happening today? Right, and then they, oops, Gee. Now I'm worried. Okay, I'm going to do this. This is a bit tricky, and I'll just try it again. Yeah, there we go. So that light came on, you know, and they said, well, how do we see that? You know, so the children are looking at this thing differently, you know. The torch is shining on this object at the front. The light goes off. How do you see it? Right, so they're looking at something that happens every day around them, something that's completely naturalised to them, but they're now looking at it as little scientists, if you like. Okay, so they were looking at an explanation there. They're looking at transparent, opaque and translucent materials here, and they're looking at exploring shadows there. Okay. All right, so they started off here, light as a form of electromagnetic radiation. And this is a very interesting place to start with 10 and 11-year-olds. There's a mixture of 10, the kids in the class were 10 years old and 11 years old. They're 5 and 6, mixture of kids. Right, so this is what it said. This was part of the explanation to the teachers about light. And I felt that all of that explanation, that whole 3 pages at the beginning of the materials they were using, explaining to the teachers what light is and what it is and how it works and how you see things, should be seen by the kids. That's what the kids should know, not the silly little activities that followed. Do you know what I mean? They're doing this. They're okay. The activities were fine. They would have kept the kids amused, but I don't know that they would have learned much about light. Okay, so they did things like this. What's this and what does it do? I'll take you through this pretty quickly because I can feel I'm needing to speed this up a bit. So they put that in their books. They put that in their books. I found this stuff out myself when I was writing this, you know, working on this unit, you know, sort of infrared waves. This is visible light, so it's just, they're just waves, you know, like... Okay. Okay, so, you know, you can see that they're filling out here so you can see the word waves coming up over and over again, can't you? The repetition of the waves. And even the teachers, when they were teaching it, were moving their hands, like, show these waves. Okay, in terms of the reading, this is the kind of reading activities they did. So I'll take you through these pretty quickly when we talk about light. So, what do you mean by sources? What does a source mean here? So they distinguish between primary sources of light and secondary sources of light. Here. So every object that reflects is a, you know, this is a secondary source of light here. And the moon. Some people think the moon is a primary source of light, but it's not, of course. Okay, so they looking at words like call. What do we mean call here? This. You can see there's very close reading of the text, you know, taking the kids. So the kids are going to get the meanings in this text. They're not just sent off to read it on their own. Okay. And there's lots of other things too. They explored this notion of wave-like, but of course, understanding what waves is. There's their understanding of a wave, isn't it? Or even from Princess Mary, you know. It's a very opposite joke, isn't it? Okay, it's not a joke. So... little big waves and little waves, and so they looked at that. You know, kids are all in there, they get this, long wavelength, short wavelength. Okay. Alright, so they were taking up this notion of different kinds of wavelength as part of their understanding, so that light is a very short wavelength, right? Whereas radio transmitters have got a very long wavelength, so they understood that. All right, things like are being radiated, and taking this up in terms of nominalisation here. So radiation here, and they did a little bit of work on nominalisation. And this is their register continuum. They filled this out in their booklets. They had this in their booklets. Yeah. So this is the kind of shifting across from these more technical meanings across to more common sense meanings, or at times they might start here and move across here, but this kind of moving backwards and forwards, but providing these kind of middle spaces, I think, is very important for the kids. They looked at the representation, how you represent things, different ways of representing the sun, very realistically, you know, to abstractly, you know. So this is something that would be taken for granted, but it's not. In terms of meaning making, you know, this is quite a shift for little kids to move to these more abstract realms, even in things like the picture of the sun. So things like that. So this is, you know, kind of taking them through this, something like this to something like that. Okay. All right. So they then moved on to exploring shadows, and this was part of the procedure of the investigation, where they're exploring those as part of their investigation. They had to read this, and there was a very close reading. In fact, a very close reading. They actually analysed it in terms of, you know, the transitivity again. Okay, so you can see in the kids, the teachers took them through all of that. So, where should we fix the measurement screen? Okay, where? This tells us where. This is this circumstance of place, right? Right. That's where we should shift it, right? How should we fix it? As in the photo above. What does that mean? As in the photo above. It means we should fix it exactly the way we see it in the photo. You know what I mean? This sort of close unpacking and intense almost unpacking of the meanings. Okay, here are the kids doing their biz. There's Caitlin. We'll hear about Caitlin in a minute. So they had great fun. They loved it, you know. They were doing this 2 days before the end of the school holidays. They were still doing it. Yeah, and the kids still wanted to do it. Most of the kids, some of the kids didn't, but the teacher certainly wanted to continue on. So 2 days before the end of the year. This is amazing. Okay. Okay, here's some of the text. We could look at the visuals here, but we'll just have a look really at one of the independent constructions. So this is independent construction now. The children, the end of the unit, or this part of the unit, that's what they were. So light is produced and emitted from the primary source of light, the light bulb. Some of this light travels to the secondary source, the object. And once that portion of the light reaches the object, it reflects off it and travels to the first mirror of the periscope. When some of the light gets to the first mirror, it reflects directly onto the second mirror, where it gets reflected once more, but this time out of the periscope and into our eyes so we can see. So it goes on. It's just fantastic, isn't it? I would defy many adults, even science teachers, to write something as clearly as that. It's just brilliant. Okay, so that's one of the stronger writers. Here's one of the weaker writers in the class. This is Gemma. Not weaker. I don't know that she was one of the weakest, but certainly not a strong writer. And you can see, you know, light is emitted from the primary. You can see the spelling error here, the capital here, and, you know, this is tragic, of course. He says, ironically, because, you know, she's making other much more complex meanings that are much more, in my view, much more important. The modalisation, the modal, some of these light rays, you know, this notion that it's not all of the light rays. Some of the light rays are hitting me and you're getting them back. Some of them are going off here. What a waste. No, that's a joke. They hit Caitlin's hand, which is now showing the number 5. You saw Caitlin doing the number 5. Okay. That's very impressive text from that student there. Okay, so I think that just about finishes our filming.